Well, it feels a little unfair since we're talking about quality that I get to talk again. But I'm excited, and I thought John was going to run after the challenge of a wrestling match up here, but I see him back there, and I thought. I really enjoyed everything that we've heard, and I tweaked up my thoughts a little bit. I was going to speak kind of broadly about the role of imagination in bringing social change, and I still want to talk about imagination, but in light of some of the things that John and Cameron and Lauren and others have shared, I want to think about it in terms of the economic imagination, kind of hone in on that a little bit. And it's certainly something that we've been learning in Philadelphia. And so as we settle back in from lunch, I thought, also because I'm a little homesick, I could just show you a few pictures. And don't think this is too formal, just as our family photo album. And but this is the world that I'm in right now for the last 20 years. And first of all, our neighborhood has suffered pretty deeply from the patterns of inequity and of the patterns of kind of global capitalism as our neighborhood formed around the factories, right? And so there used to be signs that, like, my neighborhood is called Kensington, and it was the billboard said, "Kensington is where everyone wants to live." And the saying was that you could walk down a block and have a job by the end of the block. Those factories have moved out, and we've lost $150,000 with 700 abandoned factories. And also, sadly, the church left in many ways. People fled, and many of the churches were left abandoned. This was a cathedral on the north side of Philly where everything started for us, because this cathedral, which had been abandoned for years, became filled with homeless families, and they were living there out of desperation. And we heard about that struggle, and the newspaper, it was in the newspapers, because what happened was the archdiocese ended up trying to evict the families, and they were given a 48-hour eviction notice, and if they weren't out within 2 days, they could be arrested. The families were really, I can't tell you all the stories, but they held a press conference and they said, in all respect to the archdiocese, we've talked to the real owner of this building, the Lord, right? And God said we can stay until we find housing. And they hung a banner on the front of the cathedral that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? So it was a powerful catalytic event. That's what gave birth to our community. It's also a special place. My wife and I, we got married there, so you'll see a picture of us walking down the aisle. This is years later. We got permission to go back, and most still being the roof leaking, everything. So that's where we got married, and you'll see us riding off on our tin on a bike there. That was our stretch limo, and our neighborhood. You'll see a couple of shots of here, which is now, those row houses were formed around the factories. As the factories left, we now have 20,000 abandoned houses. We have 700 abandoned factories in our neighborhood, and locals in Philadelphia call it the Badlands. I'm always careful to correct them, and I say you got to be careful if you call any place the Badlands, because that's exactly what they said of Nazareth, right? Nothing good could come from there, and look who showed up. So we see God show up, but we also we've come to really think part of what we need is imagination, because the patterns have left us with a lot of abandonment, a lot of poverty. We live in a neighborhood that's so densely populated now with very few jobs, and so we talk about resurrection not just as something that happened, 2,000 years ago, but something that we get to participate in every day. So I wanted to just show you a couple of pictures of what that looks like. We like to do anything we can with trash to reclaim things and put life and beauty there. We used to have a garden that was entirely in computers and televisions, but then we found out you can get cancer if you eat food out of a TV, so we only grow vegetables there now. And but we have a lot of reclaimed space, and you'll see a couple of before and after shots here. This is an abandoned house, which we've been able to get for as cheap as $1. We don't even need a mortgage, pay that off in one payment. And but that's a before and that's an after shot of it. And then this is an abandoned lot that we got. It was filled with trash and tires, and then the next shot's what it is now. and the hubcap flowers back there were made by some of the teenage moms, and so it's really just reclaiming space. And then a few years ago, we had a terrible fire that started in one of the abandoned factories and burnt our whole block down. So this was right after the fire. The whole block was leveled by the fire. 100 families were affected by that. But over the last 7 years, we've rebuilt that block together, and that's what it looks like now. And what's so beautiful is everywhere we're trying to paint, pictures and images, and the role of imagination is really in art and is at the heart of our community. So you'll see, that's where the fire used to be, and we now call it Phoenix Park because, rising from the ashes. And when you look at the assets of our neighborhood, tires are among them. So we've reclaimed all the tires, and planting stuff in them and everything. And one of our newest projects has been an aquaponic system and kind of trying to do as much cutting-edge urban gardening and farming as we can. So we have 1,000 tilapia underground, and their water feeds all the raised bed gardens, and we grow food, and it's absolutely magical. The kids, this is a picture of a kid you'll see here picking sugar snap peas. But as I think about what we're doing, I think part of it is trying to recapture that imagination that our current patterns of living have left us with some pretty desperate situations, where masses of our population are living in poverty, and a handful of folks are kind of living as they wish. And I think as we think about that, a study just in the U.S. was showing that in 1965, this is a U.S. statistic, but 1965 the average wage was about $7 an hour. Of the average worker. The average CEO was making $330 an hour. That study was done more recently. The average wage is just about $7 an hour still of the average worker, and the average CEO's wage is over $1,500 an hour. And I think as we think about what the patterns of the kingdom of God look like, I think we see a radically different look at economics. We see a kingdom that, as the beautiful verses in Luke says, the mighty are cast from their throne, the lowly are lifted, the hungry are sent away, the hungry are fed, and the rich are sent away empty. This radical gospel, as we talk about justice, has an economic dimension. But I also think that when we think about that, it's not a punitive thing that God doesn't like the rich or something. But I think that the good news is that God didn't mess up, right? God didn't make too many people or not enough stuff. But as Gandhi said, there's enough for everyone's need. There's just not enough for everyone's greed. And so this idea that is weaved all through Scripture is that we would have this day our daily bread. One of the very first scriptures that we have before the the Israelites even have the 10 Commandments is Exodus 16. God rains down manna from heaven. Here's their hunger, pours out bread from heaven. But the commandment that they're given is don't take more than you need for a day. And there will be enough for everybody. In fact, they're ordered by God to take one day's ration in the Ark of the Covenant to remember that providence, but also to remember not to stockpile for tomorrow while folks don't have enough for today. And I think that message, is one that there is enough for this day, our daily bread. Or as Proverbs, gives this really great vision that give me neither poverty nor riches. For in my poverty I might be forced to steal, and in my riches I might forget my God. And I think that's what we're really talking about, is an economy of enough, right? Where to love our neighbor as ourselves radically redefines the way that we think about stuff, right? So in the early church, it doesn't get any better in the early church. Like one of the signs of Pentecost, right, when the Holy Spirit falls on the early Christians, is they start sharing. No one claimed any of their possessions were their own. They shared everything they had. And then it says there were no needy persons among them. And as we look at the economy of the early church, it was so radical. I think it's, the Basil the Great and so many of the great church fathers and mothers, they went so far as to say, if we have more than we need while someone else has less, then we are thieves. Vincent de Paul said, when I give bread to the hungry, I get on my knees and I ask for forgiveness. I'm only returning what was stolen. I mean, that's a radical ethic, that the early Christians, if there wasn't enough food for everybody, they would fast until everybody could eat together. I don't know exactly what that means for us today, but I think it's a critique of the inequity at least, and I think of great folks like Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement. She kind of dusted off some of that radical economics and said, if we have 2 coats, we've stolen one. John Wesley, who was a radical on economics. I grew up Methodist, and I just talked to the Methodist bishops, and I said, John Wesley was so wild. One has to ask the question, if he were alive today, would he be a Methodist? They didn't quite get that joke. But, I like John Wesley said, if I find money in my hands, I get it out of my hands as quick as I can, lest it make its way into my heart. And he said, if I should die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief. So, I mean, I'm not saying we all got to get back there. I'm saying that, I'm not here to prescribe how everybody else needs to live either. I got enough work on myself, But I do know that there is a freedom that I've seen in folks throughout history that have discovered that liberation from the power of stuff. Because as Mother Teresa has been one of those teachers for me, and she used to say, sometimes we find that the more we have, the less we are. That our possessions begin to possess us. And this idea that we can't serve God and money is a very interesting one. That, I think that what that looks like for us, to me, is that it's not just about the stuff. I think it's about if we really encounter our neighbor, and that's why I began with the relationships. Like, what does it mean, right, to live in a family that is so dysfunctional that we have brothers and sisters that are dying because they don't have a mosquito net that costs $3, and so what does it look like? And I want to suggest that, that's the role of imagination, and it's not that just everybody's going to give up everything and live on the streets, but each of us gets to figure out how to enact Jubilee and how to use our gifts wherever we are to be a part of the redistribution and a part of interrupting those patterns of inequity. And when I was I spoke recently at the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI, which is this kind of self-proclaimed think tank for American capitalism. And we had this debate where they said, was Jesus a communist or a capitalist? And, it was fun. And I would like to think that in a moment of divine inspiration, I said something that I didn't even think about it. I said, I don't think Jesus was anything that ended in ist or ism. I don't think that Jesus can be confined to any system, but Jesus was the incarnation of love. Love with skin on. And in Jesus, we see that love means we hold our possessions with open hands. And so when we look at, people as they're born again, like Zacchaeus, the tax collector, it often means radically redefining their possessions, selling half of everything he owns, paying people back 4 times what he owed them, spinning that system on its head. But I also think that in the early church, redistribution wasn't a prescription for community. It was a description of it, right? So we can't start with the stuff, and that's why I think, love can't be legislated. It's not about trying to, create some new form of communism or something like that. I am a strong believer that if we really discover this love of neighbor as ourself, then Capitalism as we see it right now won't be possible, and Marxism won't be necessary. But that loving our neighbor as ourself will radically interrupt those current patterns of inequity. And it'll do it because we see people in whatever places and sectors of society that we're in that are moved by this simple vision of love. And so I don't pretend to be an economist or anything like that, but I do know that the best lessons I've learned are from the children. And one of the kids that taught me this lesson best was in India. And as some of you know, I worked with Mother Teresa while I was over there in the nuns. And every Tuesday, one of the things that we would do is hang out with the street kids. And Mother Teresa said, these kids, 8 years old, 10 years old, they're very precious to God. And so she said, every Tuesday we'll throw them a party. So we would go out and we'd cook a huge meal and we'd play games in the streets, And this one day, as we got 100 kids there and we're doing our thing, this one kid comes up and he tells me it's his birthday. And you can just see his heart sink, and knowing he's not going to get any presents. And so I'm a softie. Like all the nuns told us, you can't get presents, you can't play favorites. There's 100 kids. So I'm like, okay, but it's his birthday, It was also his birthday last week, but, no, anyway. But I go, so I sneak off and I'm trying to think, what can I get him and get away with it, And so I go off and I get him an ice cream cone. And I have no idea how long it had been he had ice cream, because when he gets the ice cream cone, he's just absolutely mesmerized. He's like, and then his knee-jerk reaction, his impulse is, this is too good to keep for myself, right? So he yells at all the other kids and he goes, we've got ice cream! And he brings them all over and he lines them up, right? And he goes, everybody's going to get a lick! And he goes down the line. He's like, your turn, like full circle. And then he comes to me. He's like, after like 100 kids, he's like, you get a lick too, Shane! I got this spit phobia thing going, so I kind of like, I fake a lick, I'm like, chocolate. He's like, no, it's vanilla. But, anyway, but that kid knew the secret, right? He knew the secret. That the best thing to do with the best things in life is to give them away. It's not to hoard them for ourselves. And I think that's part of the secret that we lose if we're not careful, right? It's not that the stuff is so bad. It's that it's so good, that we want to share it. And that's why I fundamentally believe that as we talk about economics and all of this stuff, that it's not about guilt. I don't think Jesus came to give us guilt. Jesus came to give us life. And the fact is, a lot of us are settling for something short of life. We're settling for stuff, and for a clutter of consumerism that leaves us wanting. And we end up, in some of the richest corners of the world. We have the highest rates of loneliness, depression, and suicide because we're living behind those walls, right? We're living in these narcissistic worlds where we don't encounter the pain and the suffering. And I think when we do, it moves us with compassion. I think that's why Philip Knight didn't want to go to Indonesia to see where Nike shoes are made, because he has a conscience. Behind that I know that when we encounter the collision between what we have and what others don't, like love provokes something in us to be more creative. And so as we open it up a minute in conversation, I want to just share a few of the ways that we're experimenting with that in our context and with kind of economic imagination. And a bunch of years ago, we became very discouraged with the state of the church. Obviously, the church was literally bankrupt in much of our city. And we also saw the patterns of economics in the church. And we saw studies like the Empty Tomb Project that show that they delineate, how churches spend the tithes and offerings. And over, it comes up that over 95% of church offerings in the U.S. were staying internally. I don't know what it is here, but I imagine it's very similar. A lot of it was to, pay staff and maintain buildings, and very little of it was making its way into the neighborhoods and into the real lives of people. In fact, in the early church, compassion and sharing wasn't like a budget item. It was the budget. You know, it was what they were doing. And so there's a great theologian from the UK named Ray Mayhew, and he wrote a paper called Embezzlement, the Sin of the Contemporary Church. He didn't mince words, and he showed some of these patterns, and it provoked something in us, not just to pick on the mega churches, but actually to begin with the kind of log in our own eye, the contradictions in ourselves, and we said, let's start doing like the early church did again, and so we started something that was originally called the relational tithe, and basically it's a bunch of us pulling together 10% of our money. And that it started as a little cluster, and now there's clusters all over the world. We've got clusters in Cuba and Africa, all over that are small groups that are giving 10% of their money together, and 100% of that is redistributed relationally, though. The only way that we can present a need is if it's someone we know. We don't give to any organizations. We only give to neighbors, and it's kind of trusting the wisdom and discernment that comes from real friendship, right? So just to make that concrete, in my neighborhood, one of my neighbors had his tires slashed and vandalism done to his car. And we were able to come around and say, hey, there's a bunch of us Christians that pull our money together, and we believe in bearing each other's burdens. So we want to help you get your car fixed. He was so stoked about it. He's a really good friend of mine. He was so stoked about that now he wants to be a part of it, Our corner store across the street was robbed at gunpoint, and we were able to replenish what they lost in that robbery. Like it's ways that we can actually substantially show that we're a community. And one way, there's lots of ways we express it, but one way is by sharing stuff and bearing the burdens that come. So right now, no matter whether someone's tithe is $10 or $10,000 per month, we pull money together and we make decisions on kind of a consensus basis, sort of like the early church. And we're doing, hundreds of thousands of dollars of relational sharing all over the world. And I think it's stuff like that, couchhopper.com and like all kinds of stuff that Google and other folks, folks are all, I think that idea of collaboration and community is kind of starting to spark, and that's one way that we see it. Another way is that in the U.S. we've got a little bit of a healthcare crisis, in case you haven't heard, and so a bunch of folks, this is way before Barack Obama, we had to start figuring out, how are we going to share medical bills? Because when we started our community, when you're 20 years old and someone said, like, what do you do about medical coverage? We were like, we call our parents, and that's okay when you're 20, but when you're 30 and 40, that's less cool, So we've had to figure out how to do some of this. And so a group of about 300 or 400 people began sharing money together and in order to meet medical bills, right? And very innocently, every month they would put out a newsletter of who's in the hospital. And then every month they would pull money together in order to meet those medical bills. And meanwhile, they're praying for each other and cheering each other on to recover. And that snowballed. And now we have 20,000 folks that are a part of that medical collective. And every month we get a letter of who's in the hospital. We're praying for each other, and we pull our money together to meet medical bills. And right now, in that collective, we do about $15 million a year. We've done $500 million in bill sharing within that collective. And now CNN came to visit us, and they said, is this the silver bullet to the healthcare crisis in America? And one of my friends had a great answer. He said, I don't think there's any silver bullet, but it might be part of the silver buckshot. And you're not from Tennessee. Talk to me later. So I think that we have to be careful not to say that there's one anecdote for everything, because we're talking in our with this crisis alone, 40 million people or whatever that was. So it's. But I think that what's beautiful is we can say, hey, the church can be more responsible. The government can. Maybe we can all say, hey, things like good health care and good education are things that we want to make sure are not just a privilege for folks that can afford it. And all of us can wrestle with like how we can imagine solving that problem together, And we also have like nurses and doctors that are opening up free medical clinics. There's all kinds of places where I think each of us is invited to take who we are and connect it with that movement of what God's doing and reimagine, the economics of how we look at things. But in the end, I think what's so important is that each of us is starting with this idea that what does love my neighbor require of me, and how can that transform the way I think about my own economics. But in the end, it's really about relationship. And I look at Matthew 25, where Jesus kind of, gives this account of the final judgment, and all of us are before God. And according to Jesus, the final judgment is not just a doctrinal test, where we're asked virgin birth, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree, or creation or evolution, but actually, the final questions will be asked are, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? And when I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? And so I think all of us get to think about how we can embody that. And sometimes it means, I think it always begins with real relational, concrete acts of love and compassion. But it also invites us to imagination, and I think of my friends who are scientists. Back in the States, I lived with a scientist, and he was so deeply troubled by the water crisis. He said, the biggest cause of death is lack of access to clean water and, waterborne illnesses. He's wrestling with that. And he says, as a scientist, that messes with me because I feel like we can solve this one, He started studying bacteria, and then he met up with folks that are doing clean wells and, technology that's trying to solve that. And they started this little think tank. And it's beautiful because the scientists were thinking, but then they met these entrepreneurial business folks that said, listen to this. In industrialized countries, we spend enough money on bottled water that if we just drank tap water and reallocated that money, we could provide water access for the whole world. And so they started a bottled water company that basically bottles tap water. And by basically, I mean they bottle tap water and they sell it, But all the profits that they make go to dig wells with indigenous labor. And on every bottle of water, it says, when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. So I think what's beautiful about this conversation that we're having is that we each get to bring our pieces to the table and our gifts. And no one said it better than Frederick Buechner that said, we take our deepest passions and we connect them to the world's deepest pain. So in the end, the real question becomes not just, am I going to be a scientist or an entrepreneur or a doctor, but what kind of scientist or entrepreneur or doctor am I going to be? How can we take our gifts and use them for something that's bigger than ourselves? Use them to contribute to God changing the things that are wrong in the world so that the patterns of this world look a little bit more like the patterns of the kingdom of God. Amen. Greg, do I have time to show that little video? So I began with the kids, and because I'm missing home, I thought I might close with the kids in my neighborhood. We had this exact conversation with the kids, and sometimes I think these conversations can be really heavy. So when we were having it with our kids, this is a little bit ago, so the statistics might not be spot on, but we were talking about inequity, and I thought the kids were just brilliant. So let me bring their voice into it, and then we'll open it up. So here we are. We're at 3200 Potter Street in a house that we fixed up. This used to be abandoned. Did you guys know that? Yeah. This is an abandoned house, and this is a space where we hope to have some computers and art stuff for the kids to come and hang out in. And so we're here now with a bunch of the kids from the neighborhood, and we're going to do a little game. You guys, we've been talking about why we have so much abandoned houses like this in a neighborhood where there's so many people who need housing, where there's folks on the street and there's people who need homes, but then there's so many abandoned houses. And in the same way, there's a lot of people who need food and a lot of people who have extra food in their closet, right? So this is the situation in our world. 20% of the people have 80% of the world's stuff. And that means 80% of the world has only 20% of the stuff. So here we are with the kids. We've got 8 on this side and 2 on this side. 80% and 20%. Now we're going to divide up all of the food and toys and stuff. Deal? We just gave out school supplies in the neighborhood. Who all got school supplies? We gave out school supplies to about 400 kids. So let's look at what this looks like in our world. all of you would only get 2. And then you 2 would have all of these. That's crazy, huh? We got 10 of everything. So how many do you all get? 2. You would have to share 2 between all of you. And these guys would get all of those to play with, just the 2 of them. So we like to play Frisbee, right? You guys would have to share 2 Frisbees, and these guys would get 8. 35,000 children will starve to death today because they don't have enough food. Because what happens is you guys would get 2, and they would get 8. Folks need milk for their kids. You guys would get 2, and they would get 8. This is medicine here for a cold. So if we think about all the people in the world that don't have medicine, and that's what happens here, you guys would get 2, and they would have all of those. And it's getting ready to be cold, so some folks are going to be cold and only have 2 hats for all of you to share, while all of these hats go to folks over here. And see, they might even have extra hats in their closet that they could share with you guys, but they have all of this stuff.
And it's a shame because they do have all this extra food, and they know they do, and they also know that in the world there's people that hardly have anything at all, and they just keep it or sometimes even throw it away. We're gonna feel bad because while they're over there having fun and eating, and they're not cold and they're warm and they're having fun, we're over here starving to death, cold, and we can't play because we all can't share. We're supposed to share because that's what God meant us to do. As stewards, we're supposed to share, but we don't. Some of us have all this, and some of us have this little bit, and it's a shame because it really is like that.
The one prayer, yeah, it's beautiful. The one prayer that I'll never forget one of the kids wrote was, God, could you please make all the rich people poor so they can feel what that's like, and make the poor people rich so that's what they can feel like what that's like. And then, God, bring us all back to medium. So, thank you so much.
So I know we're post-lunch and we need to ensure we keep going here, but why don't we all just stand up for 1 second and stretch our legs a bit before we go to the next table discussion. Awesome, that's great. Now, take your seat again. Brilliant. Now, guys, we're going to move into our table discussion now, and we're going to be a little bit more directive on this one because Shane has said some amazing things there. Just jotted some things around Jesus versus communism or capitalism, using words like guilt, action, relational tithing, but also the big line that really stuck out for me, and we'd like to begin to discuss more, not purely this topic, but he talked about the church, or how can the church be more responsible? Now, we're going to be building on that theme as we hear later from the Archbishop and Shane again, and if the Papal Nuncio coming in from a Catholic tradition and others. But think of that question in your mind when you're discussing. It's not just going to be restricted to that, because I know you might have some other questions, but think in that as you're having the table discussion. It's going to be slightly shorter, our table discussion, so we can have more time for questions with Shane. So for 10 or 12 minutes, let's gather around our tables. Let's discuss. Let's keep that overarching question in the back of our minds, and I'll call you back in about 10, 12 minutes, and we'll have some Q&A with Shane and then move on. Great. Thanks, guys.